So tonight's topic is a focus on the formless aspect of the human being, the aspect which I today wrote a little bit about and referred to as more quantum-like than mechanical-like. And what I mean by that is that for some of us who might be a little bit scientific inclined, the notion of mechanical physics, Newtonian physics, and quantum physics may be something we're familiar with. And in very broad terms, we can say that mechanical physics focuses on the material and the form and the rules that apply on the level of the broad scale of life. There are rules that apply to the large and very large in life. They are the movements and the experience of life that we have on a daily living basis, where there is differentiation in form that the senses can pick up, and things happen according to time and space, cause and effect, and they are linear in appearance. And the laws that govern that, which we can measure, are called the laws of mechanical physics or Newtonian physics. And there are a lot of constants that apply to the laws. We measure them and they are constantly the same. For example, the speed of light is a constant. The acceleration due to gravity here on Earth is a constant. And there are Planck's constant is another constant. Pi is another constant. So we have come to understand the laws of Newtonian physics based on measurement and observation. And so the scientists have created concepts that are models of best fit that describe the laws that are at play. And as we look at the world on a more micro level, so going deeper and deeper into the substance, the laws of physics seem to change from what we would call the Newtonian laws or the mechanical laws of physics. So that includes things like gravity and pressure and equilibriums, speed. So a lot of the things that we would apply when building things in daily living. So as we start looking deeper at the substance of the form which we're so familiar with, it tends to lose form the deeper and deeper we go. And what is observed is that there is more and more space and less substance. And going deeper, deeper still, we find that that substance, what appears like substance on the surface, reveals itself as being energy, you could say, in movement. And as you go deeper and deeper, we find that there is nothing at the core. And often, if we come to understand or start looking at quantum physics, which is not really something that I or you or most people in the world will ever come close to getting a grasp on. But as we understand the difference, for example, between the two types of physics, we may make the mistake of thinking, oh, now that I see quantum physics is about going deeper into something and seeing that actually the real, what we might say, the real substance is that there is nothing. We might think, oh, well, mechanical physics is not the truth. That we can now discard mechanical physics. And this often happens because we tend to understand mechanical. It's more understandable because it's more observable. It's on the level of daily living. So we tend to come to understand mechanical physics as a learnt subject or topic, before we understand quantum physics. And so, as I mentioned several days back, the brain is not very good at thinking, or human thinking process is not really very learned. And so we make a lot of mistakes. And so if we learn something new that seems to be deeper, we have a habit of saying, oh, well, now this must be the truth, or this must be real. We tend not to be able to hold things that seem to be contradictions. We're not very good at holding contradictions, so we tend to polarize and then decide which one we prefer, and make one of them good and the other bad, or one right and one wrong, one true and one false. And I think a deeper understanding of physics as a whole will say that both quantum laws and mechanical laws coexist. They are part of the one system, and they express themselves depending on what angle we are looking from and what we are looking at. So if we're looking at the surface, what expresses itself and what is in play is the mechanical physics. And as we look from a different angle and look at a different place, if you like, we find that what is seen is different. Now that doesn't mean that we have to choose one or the other. We ideally will come to see that they coexist, that it isn't one or the other, but rather one and the other. And our brain doesn't like that, especially if we've come to understand quantum physics to some degree. It might feel accomplished, and it then wants to make quantum physics real, mechanical physics not real, because most people understand mechanical physics and not quantum physics. So in doing that, the brain is, the identity is actually creating a form of boost for itself by making one real, the one it understands that most people don't, and the other as unreal. So if we can transcend that and see that the two exist simultaneously and they are complementary, they are what make up the whole, we can then start to apply that to the human experience. The human being is part of life, part of the world. And what I've just discussed is the world as seen through the eyes of physics, and that the world as seen through the eyes of physics has different depths to it. There is the surface layer, which is really what you could call the expression. It's where we interact and the level that we experience through the senses. And as you dive deeper into the core of the substance, we find the formless. And they are two ends of the one unit, you could say, which really means no separation between the two. Two aspects of the one thing, life. And that's why life is well described by the word paradox. The nature of life, when we look at it, is filled with paradox. And one of the interesting phenomena that we might come to recognize is that life, the whole universe, tends to be constructed on mirror down versions of the bigger picture. So if you come to see a set of principles on a level that you are able to observe, you can run with the notion that the same sort of principles that you can observe and relationships that you can observe on one level exist on a broader level. So one example of this is design structures of living organisms follow or have a very repetitive pattern to them. And it's the Fibonacci sequence, I think, is one way of describing it. And you can find certain geometries repeating themselves in many different structures. And when we look at the egoic structure, for example, we can see that on a smaller level within the individual, there is this seeking for more, this willingness to exploit in order to get more, because the egoic structure or the doership and attachment to outcome is looking to boost itself up in an attempt to feel complete and feel like it actually has meaning and substance. And then when we look at society and societal structures, we see that those societal structures, which are a level up or several levels up from the human structure, we see that the same principles are what exist on that level above. So when we look at life in a way that is understandable, because it's described in concepts of physics that have been put in place because scientists have observed life consistently, and this isn't an argument for science. I'm talking about, and it's not an argument against science for that matter. I think in accepting the whole, we really need to do exactly as I'm suggesting here, which is to accept everything and not to isolate something and discriminate and turn it into false or turn it into truth, but rather see that there are many different modalities that can understand life. And so science is one of those modalities that has come through humans throughout history that are extremely insightful. So there are many of the revolutionist scientists that have come up with amazing insights. Copernicus was highly misunderstood because he could see something that others couldn't. And Pythagoras and many other scientists were persecuted because they put forward a different view of life than was the accepted model at the time. So one of the same principles in spirituality as there is in science is, and not all scientists exhibit this, is an open mind and a willingness to observe and to put things together, to draw conclusions. And there often is a requirement for insight to happen, and that insight is often said to have come from outside. So Einstein, when he came up with his theory of, or his formula, E equals mc squared, he was a instrument through which life was functioning, and he was particularly designed to understand the topic he was investigating and inquiring into. And yet at some point he reached what seemed to be his limits, and he let go of trying to solve the problem. And then he said he received the answer from outside, which is really, maybe we can look at it as a connection to this quantum side of the human being, a connection to a part that is not the conscious mind, which we are much more familiar with. And in dropping the working mind, not the thinking mind, but even the working mind, which is the functional thinking in daily living, and opening up, there are many examples that scientists have referred to, that artists have referred to, and that mystics refer to, of information coming from what they describe as outside, which really means outside of the realm of the thought process that they are used to being familiar with. So we have these models that have been put forward by science, which, because of the fact that they come from insight and observation and critical thinking, and because I've mentioned that the universe often follows similar principles on mirrored down and mirrored up versions of a particular layer, we might be able to start looking at the human being, which is part of life, as having the same principles in play as a broader aspect of life has, which is both the physical and the formless. Two aspects of the one self. And we tend to be familiar with the gross aspects of the human being, with the form and those components like thought, which is a more subtle form of form, and emotions and feelings. Those are aspects that we are particularly familiar with. And as we find our outward-looking mind slowing down and more interest on the formless gaps, you could say, in between the form, or a turning inward and a resting in the meditation experience, which includes in that experience much less form, primarily because the senses are made somewhat redundant in the process of meditation. The process of, or the meditating, when meditation happens, the need for the senses is much less, and there is a movement which we can refer to as sense withdrawal. And attention or awareness starts to become aware of the open space that is alive and filled with presence, and yet not filled with the experience of daily living. And this aspect of the human being is what I would say is very much connected to and one with the physical aspects of the body and the external world. However, this is the deeper or the inner world that we can refer to as the quantum aspect of the human being. And this aspect, because it doesn't reside and exist on the level of form, is much less defined, in fact not at all defined, not at all touched by what happens on the level of the flow of life. And to the extent that we know ourselves only as the form which exists on the level of the flow of life, it makes sense that we're going to feel very much defined by what happens, by the circumstances and the events that happen, which essentially mean, on the circumstantial level, the flow of either pleasure or pain. So circumstance is going to be physically pleasurable or painful, emotionally pleasurable or painful, financially pleasurable or painful. If you break your favorite vase that was given to you by your mother, who might have passed away, there may be emotional pain at having the vase break, which is a sadness that something that you held dear, something that was a reminder of your relationship with your mother, is now broken. Now, that is emotional pain. It doesn't have to turn into suffering, just like none of the other forms of pain. If you stub your toe, that is physical pain. If you have a stomachache, that's physical pain. If you break your leg, that's physical pain. That doesn't have to turn into suffering. The emotional sadness of a friend telling you that, or an emotional sadness that might happen when a friend tells you that they didn't feel you were there for them. And your heart might hurt at the fact that your friend felt you weren't there for them, where in fact, the last thing that you wanted to do was to upset them. It wasn't your intention to upset them. And so if they show you that they are upset, that is not something that you're going to be excited about. Now, if you were excited about something, that would be a form of emotional pleasure. But it makes sense that if your friend expresses that you hurt them, even if it wasn't your intention, or especially if it wasn't your intention, then you might explain to them and apologize to them. But you won't feel excited and good that they're feeling hurt. But that doesn't have to turn into a sense of shame or a sense of blame towards your friend for having maybe an irrational expectation of you. If it turns into blame or suffering, just like if the physical pain turns into blame or suffering, that's based on a different aspect to the biological aspect that is experiencing the situation on a pleasure or pain basis. So the flow of life is always pleasure or pain, and to the extent that we only know ourselves as the physical, we are always going to be experiencing the pleasure or pain as something that is adding to us or taking away from us. Which is why life is so uncomfortable for the majority of people that haven't had the good fortune of hearing that there is this other aspect to the human being, an aspect to the human being that has always been there, an aspect of the human being that is much different in characteristic than the physical aspect. Not different as in not who we are, or who we are versus not who we are, but rather two facets of the whole. And if we can come to understand and know and rest in the formless, as well as knowing the form, which is where our preferences lie, where our personality and other aspects of our human characteristics lie, our gender, our age, all of those lie on the physical level. And to the extent that we can understand both the physical and the formless, or the form and the formless, the two tend to intertwine and become one and dance together through life. And the essence of the formless can start to pervade onto the level of daily living. And what that allows us to do is to know ourselves differently, and therefore assess what outcomes mean to us in a more holistic way. So, to the extent that we know ourselves as the form, what tends to get put in place is this psychological identity that we can call a belief system, a deeply ingrained and very complex set of beliefs based on the principal beliefs that I am the doer and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Now, that structure of beliefs has been put in place based on the feedback loop that the human being has experienced moment after moment after moment from a very young age. And that feedback loop, which includes in it the sense that I am this physical form-based entity that is affected by pleasure and pain, that in the experience feels separate, feels independent, feels isolated and insulated from life, meaning has no sense that it is actually being formed by whatever happens in its environment. So that is the actuality, is that the human being is never insulated from life. The human being is always completely determined by factors that we can say life delivers. Life delivers the coming together of the sperm and the egg. And that entity, that organism, starts to grow, following really what we could call a divine or amazingly creative blueprint. So the organism starts growing, arms and legs, the lungs, the heart, the brain, the eyes. The whole organism grows and becomes more and more complex, following a blueprint that dictates how it grows. And the organism is never independent from the environment that it finds itself in. And once it's born, a lot of the inputs that become part of this biological and psychological entity are inputs from the parents, society, the political system that we grow up in, the religious system we grow up in, the school that we go to, the friends that we make, the parents that we have. And all of those principles are delivered to us and become part of who we know ourselves as. That we can call new conditioning, that is delivered in each moment and becomes part of our up-to-date conditioning. So in each moment, the human being is a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that got put in place when the sperm and the egg came together, and then that grew according to the blueprint, plus the new conditioning that in cumulative effect is what we will call our up-to-date conditioning. So that then delivers a particular experience of life, an experience that we don't dictate. The way that the senses pick up the external world is not in our control. We may have poor eyesight, we may have good eyesight. The way that the world is sensed in terms of it being a world of linear time, thanks to the faculty of memory that creates the ability to remember a past and brings that into the present moment, which has its problems to some extent because it creates a psychological image of the world that keeps us outside of the present moment. However, memory in itself is not the problem. If we wished our memory would no longer be there, what we would find is that we would have all sorts of problems living in daily life that we take for granted at the moment. So seeing your partner coming into the room, seeing your sister or your brother or your parents, or reading a book, all of this is based on memory. And if that wasn't there, we wouldn't know much at all. So because this is the way that the life experience is created, because of the way that the human develops, we experience a world of time and space. And that experience of the world creates a feedback loop that sets in place this psychological identity that knows life according to the experience that it's had moment after moment after moment for years and years and years. And that is based on the experience, which really only informs the human being about a certain depth of its layers, down to the emotional level, you could say. So we have the physical, the senses, which is what brings into existence the sense of the physical, the thinking, feelings and emotions. And then life happens, and the human being interprets life according to this psychological identity. And that psychological identity essentially feels attacked by the nature of life. The nature of life is change. The nature of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. The nature of life is uncertainty. And the psychological identity that has been put in place as part of the human development is not at all comfortable with the nature of life. It is continually in resistance to what is happening, continually feeling that the other is an enemy, a competitor, a rival, or someone that we depend on, someone that we need in order to make us complete. So a disconnection from the deeper aspect of ourself, which actually resides outside of the flow of life, or on a level where the flow of life no longer exists. A disconnection from that means that we don't have the benefit in daily life of knowing ourselves at that level. And once that sets in, what we find is the benefit of knowing this deeper aspect of ourselves, where we find automatically, not because we have to create some sort of intellectual justification or intellectual acceptance, not because of an intellectual acceptance, not because of an intellectual justification, but because of the very nature of what the human being is deep down. What we find is when circumstance is painful, the pain only penetrates down to a certain depth of how we know ourselves. It remains on the biological level. And at our depth, the reverberations of the pleasure and pain are not felt. Which really means when that connection is true and when it's stable and when it is established in a way where we have known ourselves at our depth for a long time, when pain is delivered through circumstance, we know that this happens in life. Our attitude is, yes, these things happen. These things are not an attack on who I am at my core. And so we don't find ourselves buffeted in between the waves of pleasure and pain in the same way as we do when there isn't a connection to the core that is very still and silent, eternal, infinite, and formless. This core is self-confirming and self-contenting, meaning it is at peace, it is content, not due to any external causes. It is a causeless contentment. If we think about that for a little bit, which might be hard for the intellect to grasp, but as we contemplate this notion, which we've heard many times in spiritual seeking, the peace that now I forget it. The peace sort of beyond understanding, which is pointing at the fact that it is a causeless peace, a causeless contentment. So it's beyond our understanding, because our understanding tends to look at life on the surface level as being, causal. If I get this, then I'm going to feel something. So the causeless contentment is something that the intellect would have struggled reconciling. How can there be contentment when you aren't getting something? And so if we can get our head around it and at least trust that that is an accurate description, we might come to understand that what I am at my core is peace, is content. It doesn't need to find it. It doesn't need to develop or grow into a different identity or a different being in order to find peace. It already is peace. The peace is one with it. The peace is our nature, you could say. So the more we ground into that being, the less that the psychological identity, the less that the attitude of doership and attachment to outcomes is seen to be accurate. So the more we ground into a place of witnessing life, seeing it as a happening, seeing the movements of the body as automatic and biological, a movement according to the particular makeup of the body and life circumstance as it happens to be in that moment. Meaning we see something, we hear something, we smell something, we taste something, we touch something. None of which that we smelt, saw, tasted, touched, or heard was in our control. Something flew across the horizon, or some sound happened, and without us being in control of hearing it or seeing it, that happened. And then a reaction, a complex set of reactions happen in the body, mind, organism, and a feeling of fright might happen. A thought about, well, that's an interesting bird. I've never seen one of those before. It could be the thought that goes through our head. There could be a reaction of fear in seeing a snake, for example. And that reaction is based on something that happened in the circumstance. It was registered by the body and the senses, and then that continued into a more complex set of functions in the body. And so we're always functioning like that, automatically, not because there is an entity that is the controller of how we function. That entity, which is often referred to as the me, is fictitious. Well, not entirely fictitious in that it exists in the form of thought. However, what it claims and what it sees, what it thinks of itself, is erroneous, is not in line with what is actually here and happening. So as we rest in this depth of the human being, what we could call consciousness or awareness or source, our core, it's also referred to as being or isness or existence. As we rest in that aspect of the human being, life starts to be seen much more as is described through spiritual teachings, much more described as the mystics would describe it, rather than the way that we have come to see life based on the rudimentary or the average development cycle of the human being interprets life a certain way. And so when we rest in this deeper aspect of the human being, where there is an understanding that I don't need to go anywhere, I don't need to control anything, I don't need to insist that the other acts one way or the other, we start to see life as a whole, life as one big movement, life described in the Hindu religion as a rising in consciousness or a play of consciousness, and seeing it all as in perfect harmony, including the painful events. Understanding that life is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, and that the circumstances that happen can be seen, if we're looking at it from the quantum explanation, we could say it's all spontaneously happening, arising out of nothing and subsiding back into nothing, because the quantum explanation doesn't follow laws of mechanical physics. So from that point of view, it can be witnessed as a happening that is not causal or not exclusively causal. And from the more causal point of view, we can say life is an unfolding happening because of cause and effect, but not in my control, not in anyone's control. that each moment happens because of everything that happened before. Essentially, it happened the way it happened because of the initial impulse. What, from this causal perspective, we would say is the Big Bang, this big burst of energy that expanded and morphed into the movement of life from the beginning of time up to now, and will continue to the end of time. And humanity is just a blip in that wave of creation. We are part of the expanding energy. And from this groundedness in our being, we can see that the physical, the speaking is happening, the senses are happening, the reactions to life, the biological and the psychological reactions are all happening based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning the structure of the instrument through which consciousness is functioning. So the human being is a combination of the impersonal consciousness of Source linked to a particular body-mind organism, an instrument uniquely designed by life, and experiencing life from the perspective of that uniquely designed instrument. But the instrument can only have an experience of life once consciousness of Source functions through it as personal consciousness. So personal consciousness is the conscious experience, the daily experience of life from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism. Now, the personal consciousness experience does not denote suffering. The personal consciousness experience it denotes the experience of a human being in a world. And as long as the psychological identity has been eroded, meaning the beliefs of seeing oneself as a separate independent entity, insulated from life, and therefore seeing oneself as having complete volition and free will over whatever is chosen, and once the belief that my happiness is to be found in the future, when I gain more and more things, when I find the love of another, when I am financially independent, or when I have had enough experiences of pleasure, when that falls away, the personal consciousness experience can remain. There is no problem with experiencing life from the perspective of a human being. In fact, that is where life always has to be experienced from. The difference is that we can experience life from the perspective of the human being, having a personal consciousness experience where we only know ourselves on a shallow and limited basis, with the inclusion of a psychological identity that feels attacked and threatened by life. And if that identity falls away, the psychological identity based on the beliefs of personal doership and attachment to outcome, we remain experiencing life from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism. That body-mind organism, the physical aspect of the human being, continues to function according to its destiny, according to its preferences, according to the circumstance it finds itself in. It continues to speak, it continues to eat, it continues to sleep, it continues to experience pleasure and pain based on its biological preferences. But once the psychological identity has dissolved, there is a connection to self, which means the personal consciousness experience also knows and relates to life with a connection to a depth where the flow of life doesn't impact its sense of self. And that's where acceptance comes from. Acceptance is essentially the understanding that what will happen in each moment is what was destined to happen. My destiny unfolding, the other's destiny unfolding, and in the case of receiving pleasure or pain through the other, it's my destiny for the other to deliver the pleasure or pain that I'm destined to experience. So with that attitude, the other isn't seen as an enemy or a rival, even when they're delivering pain. Attitudinally, it will be understood, this is my destiny to receive this pain in this form. And receiving pain will have been experienced with a connection to self and known to not be something that actually challenges who we are on that level of self. So it isn't something that we need to justify. It just becomes the experience that, yes, these things happen. Yes, people are going to break into your car and steal your luggage, or take your laptop, or steal your bag and your purse. So when you see it in life, there will still be the biological reaction. You don't expect to go up to your car after having been in the shopping center and see the back window smashed. The likelihood is that your car is going to be as you left it. However, we should know by being exposed to life long enough that life is uncertainty, life is a mix of pleasure and pain, and that extreme things can happen in life. Your car may not only have had a broken back window, but the whole roof of the car park could have fallen in on your car. Now, surprising, yes, but attitudinally, it's like these things happen. We understand that the flow of life is not in our control, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, and if it's interconnected opposites, which it is, the flow of life, it can be extreme pleasure and extreme pain. And most importantly, when it doesn't shake us at our core, primarily because the suffering which arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation don't kick into action. And they don't kick into action only when the psychological identity has been dissolved. When it doesn't kick into action, someone might say, I'm so sorry for your loss. Essentially, projecting probably how they would have felt with their psychological identity in place, and projecting that onto how you must be feeling. And your experience might be, well, thank you for your sympathies, but it's okay. That would be your experience. Not some sort of bypassing where you are convincing yourself it's okay, but the actual felt experience due to a combination of two important factors. One, resting and becoming familiar with this quantum aspect of yourself, the formless aspect of yourself, the aspect of yourself that exists prior to thinking, prior to the labeling of anything as good and bad. And it requires a turning inwards, a stillness, which really means a stillness of mind. So a connecting to that, plus the weakening, the diminishing of the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. Once that diminishing of the beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome happens, the thinking, the thoughts of blame, of guilt, of worry, of expectation, all become known to be movements of thought based on a false sense of self, a false view of life. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. I wouldn't suggest that it is the type of realization that is spontaneous and radical. It's as described. There are aspects of the realization, aspects of the process that may deliver a spontaneous recognition, a spontaneous realization of an aspect of the human being, like this formless aspect, which we can describe as consciousness or awareness, and having a very still, quiet depth that we can sort of dissolve into and rest in. When I say we can connect to or rest in, it's in a sense a rolling backwards of the thinking mind and the working mind into a resting in your own being. And when that happens in contrast to suffering, or that happens for the first time and there is this recognition of that aspect of the human being, it can seem like it happens instantaneously and is spontaneous. However, it's very likely to be a continuation of having heard things before, having investigated and contemplated, looked at life, having certain ideas of yours change. For example, something as simple as, this will change. Someone can say that to you, this too will pass, or everything happens for a reason. So we might hear this and we might apply it in ways that we think are quite mundane. We might realize that something negative or bad or painful can in fact down the track turn into something positive, or something beneficial that we didn't expect. And so then our attitude to unfortunate circumstances can start to change. Now, that's the gradual changing that eventually leads to a much deeper recognition that I don't need to necessarily wait for the negative outcome to turn into something positive. I just need to see that I don't know. And beyond even I don't know, to recognize that actually what happens in the level of pleasure and pain is not an attack on who I am. So these thinking processes can happen, and then they can lead to a spontaneous recognition, which is simply part of the process. Beyond that spontaneous recognition, which is really coming into contact with an aspect of life, an aspect of self that you might not have been in contact with before. Beyond that, there are many more refinements, many more dislodging of beliefs that make up this psychological identity. So it's not something that you necessarily should have an expectation about sitting in meditation and then everything changing in an instant and waiting for that moment. I would say that it's much more about a gradual change based on thoughts that arise, contemplations that arise, and as you have an insight or see something in life, that will become the basis for the next set of thinking developments that will happen. And the thinking, the contemplating, the thoughts, which are not really your doing, they're an arising in your awareness based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which may include reading something in a book that points out that, some negative event may in fact turn into something quite positive, and then that might turn into something less positive again. That is part of your new conditioning that changes your up-to-date conditioning. And then as you observe this in your own life, the observation actually is considered, or should be considered, as new conditioning. So your own thinking, your own aha moments are actually new conditioning that add to your up-to-date conditioning. So this diminishing of the belief in personal doership and the belief that your happiness is to be found in outcomes is something that can erode away gradually. And the dropping out of the thinking mind, when it's registered that that's what's happening, that there's blame, there's guilt, there's pride, there's worry, and there's expectation about the future and regret in the past and all that. The recognizing that, that's not what I am. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer. Those mantras, those little concepts, if they become understood, they become very potent. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life is a reminder to stop being obsessed with an imagination of the future, that is just keeping you disconnected from your core. So the thought arises, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. And we drop into being, drop out of the thinking mind. And the combination of these two things, the combination of the doership identity weakening and a connection to the part of yourself that is ever present, witnesses life. That is what eventually delivers the experience of being a human in daily living, where tenants are not going to pay their rent, where partners are going to decide that they would prefer to spend time with someone else, where people that you care for are going to die, where your financial stability is going to be challenged, where the whole of society's stability might be challenged. These things are going to continue to happen, and the gift is to find ourselves connected to a part of ourselves that says, yes, this is life. And my happiness, my completeness, my peace of mind is not something dependent on life looking a certain way, because my peace of mind is dependent on the essence that every human being is. Every human being has this quantum depth. It's what's looking out of our eyes. Looking, it's that which is seeking. It's seeking outward because the intellect, the thinking mind part of the intellect, is convinced that that's where I'll find things. Not realizing that we're like the beggar sitting on a box of gold, begging for pennies. Thinking that its survival is dependent on what people will give it in the next moment. Please, can I have a penny? I'm hungry. And that beggar has forgotten that it's sitting on a fortune, sitting on a gift that means its completeness is not dependent on the external circumstance. So I'll open it up for questions, given I've spoken for an hour. Hi, Ruler. How are you? Hello, Ruler.
Oh, okay. You can hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
I wasn't expecting you guys to pick me right now, so. I am non-dual path for 15 years. I heard about you 2 years ago at one of Bruce Spira's retreats. So I'm kind of new to your teaching. I just kind of started listening now in this whole pandemic situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're wonderful. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm actually really glad that you were just talking about as far as realization being a process,
Mm-hmm.
which could seem, or I used to think was a paradox, because there's just this one moment. Anyway, after 15 years, seeing a glimpse here and a glimpse there and feeling very frustrated, about 2 years ago, I did have a realization that was unexpectedly large, and it was just basically sensation, perception. That's all there was, and basically I saw myself as a light, that I was the light of the world. That was what came to me, which I know is what Jesus said, but it was what I said at the moment of a realization. And since that time, I was able to sit anytime I would stop and sit, and I would realize that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would get caught up in life again, and so I would stop and sit, and it was literally, it was like a whole different reality. It's just a blissful feeling of connection, And my life changed dramatically, even though it was very subtle. If you really look at it, it was more of like things were, I wouldn't even notice, like I would have a neurotic habit that I've been doing for a long time. And then suddenly I would realize I hadn't done that in 2 months. I had severe clinical depression since I was 16. I'm 40 years old now. It was very, very bad. I couldn't even take care of my children, barely. And over these 2 years, I'm telling you, for me, it's a miracle because literally I'm now getting off my medication. It wasn't a possibility. It wasn't even, I went to my psychiatrist last month and whatever, I never told him about this. And he surprised me. He said, what happened? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, this isn't possible with just medication. Antidepressants don't change people like this. And I was shocked, that he said that, but he said, well, I had an epiphany. I didn't know what to say to him. I didn't, so I just told him I had an epiphany and it really changed my life. I guess my question now is, which I've asked Rupert and and it's not really a question because I kind of know the answer already, is that I feel like I've hit all these things have fallen away, like you said, but not the doer. I still feel like the doer in many cases, unless I stop and I realize that everything is knowing. It's just knowing. It's just a light. I can see that. But it seems to have like plateaued. And I feel like suddenly all of those things that fell away are still falling away. But I almost feel like I'm stuck again, I guess. And at the same time, I feel like I've been given this, I'll use a metaphor, like an injection, of truth or something. And it starts, when you get an injection and goes into your bloodstream, it doesn't just go into every corner of your body all at the same time. It slowly starts to circulate. And I feel like that's what's been happening over the past few years. This slow, going into all these corners. And now I feel like that's slowed down a lot. And I don't know that it has stopped. I don't believe it's stopped, but that's a belief. I feel like it's not moving forward. But at the same time, I can't unsee what I've seen. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to take so much of your time, but
that's okay. Go on.
This has been my main question, I guess, for a couple of months now. And I don't know what teacher to ask really about this.
So I think you're, in a way, very fortunate to have, well, I'm sure if you've seen such a change. So what sounds like happened is that whatever you were engaging in, so let's say spiritual seekings, they might sometimes feel like, you're not going anywhere. But it doesn't mean things aren't happening in terms of what's going on in your system. And then the experience you had is essentially, to me, we don't understand why these things happen, but I would say that there was a change in your biological and psychological structure that allowed this experience to happen. And the question as to whether that experience has a lasting effect or not is, very much dependent on what that experience is and one's destiny. My view on spiritual seeking is that often when someone is exposed to the more esoteric teachings that are pointing to, let's say, your essence, and the teachings will, in a way, downplay the physical aspects, and in some cases will actually say you are not the body. those teachings can create very drastic contrasts and shifts, because what they're actually delivering to your intellect is quite radically different information to what we have tended to know ourselves as. So when that happens, it's grace, it's good fortune. It means that the system has really been shaken up and rejigged and reconfigured. But the likelihood is it hasn't been rejigged and reconfigured in a way that is going to deliver very simple, ordinary peace of mind in daily living on an unbroken basis, which really means that there is likely to be remnants of the psychological identity in place, beliefs that haven't yet been highlighted as being part of the suffering dynamic. And in fact, unless our attention, unless our working mind, which is the functional part of the intellect, which isn't what causes suffering, unless that starts to be pointed in a way less radical ways than the more esoteric teachings do. So unless the intellect is pointed to practical daily living, and we are given new concepts that essentially allow us to reframe what the seeking is all about, reframe what we are compared to some of the concepts that we had been given, which, please don't take that as a criticism, because what I'm highlighting is those concepts from the other teaching did an amazing job, right? They lay the groundwork for the change that you've experienced. And then, because it's a process, as I see it, because it's a bit like, a production line, the car, starts off with a shell, and then doors get added on, and then the interior gets put on, and the frame is painted and whatever, and it goes through stage after stage after stage, and they all essentially complement each other. And it's not about deciding which one is right and which one is wrong, because if you did that, you'd have a car without doors, for example. So if you feel like you've plateaued, which is what you're suggesting, my thought is that it could well be because the teachings that you found yourself exposed to were describing life from one perspective, and life can be likened to the analogy of a coin that has two sides to it. So a lot of what I was talking about in today's satsang, there is the causal, practical daily living, and then there is this deeper aspect of ourself. And so you're actually, in a way, now in reverse. So the revelation of the formless, which you described as light, so it could have presented to you in a particular type of fashion. So the notion of light resonates with you. That could be the experience you have of that aspect of the human being. That, I guess, because I do have a familiarity with those teachings that talk about your nature as awareness, and everything happening not separate from what you are as awareness, in which it all arises, and the awareness witnesses it, and all pervades the experience, etc., etc. And so that describes one side of the coin. And for us to see it, to see that side of the coin, because it's not a side that we are particularly familiar with, is what you could call it awakening. And then we need to be reminded, well, actually it's a two-sided coin, because in order for us to see that side of the coin, sometimes the descriptions had to be quite narrow, you could say. They could be descriptions about that side of the coin that we weren't seeing at the exclusion of the other side of the coin. So often it's referred to as, truth or reality and versus illusion, or that which is real versus that which is unreal. The unreal and the illusion is not really as unreal and non-existent as we're sometimes told. So then we need to get directed back to that other side of the coin that intellectually we might have sort of discarded as really existing, and bring our seeking down to the level of practical daily living. If it gets reframed, let's say from a search, reframed, now no longer being a search for truth, no longer being a search for self, but rather being a search for peace of mind in daily living for the human being, just the reframing of the objective can mean that we start focusing on parts of the puzzle that may have gone unlooked at. Now, that doesn't mean that we are now forgetting everything else that has happened. Ideally, what it is going to be an integration of that which has been revealed, an integration of the side of the coin that we previously weren't seeing that we're now seeing, and being able to flip and see both sides of the coin simultaneously, in a way, understanding that what I am includes both sides. And in practical terms, the seeking needs to deliver a practical outcome, and that practical outcome is the end of suffering, the end of the uncomfortableness with oneself and the other. And so when we start looking at that outcome and realizing that it is simply, peace of mind is simply the absence of suffering, the falling away of the feelings that arise in relation to outcomes that happen, and becoming heavily involved in, what you are doing solely in relation to an outcome, essentially. When we realize that that's what gets in the way of the peace of mind, then our attention starts moving on to those dynamics and specifically cutting off those dynamics. And so what may feel like a plateaued process, once some new focuses are brought into play, might mean that the focus or the process gets kick-started in a sense, because there's a new phase that needs to happen.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. It's very interesting also because it feels like a new phase has to happen. That's what it feels like. And the realization was very much, it was actually just a word, the intimacy, being is closer than your breath. It's absolutely intimate. It's, and in that moment, it struck me, it is what the light. That's why, I don't know, everything became actually light. It was very, after 15 years of just small little recognitions, it was very intense. And going back to it, I didn't talk to many people about it because it sounds crazy. It was actually very blissful. My head would start pounding blissfully. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's actually what happened for 2 years. Every time I stopped and realized that again. But you're right, it was a complete shift of, this is not, reality is actually light. It was very, very radical, as you said. And I think you're right. I need to look at the other side of that, the daily living. It's funny because I feel like somehow, how did I end up here in front of Roger? It almost seems like it's just it's beyond me, but it just seems like it's the right path somehow. The next phase,
Yeah, well, in this teaching, I don't know how many talks you've listened to, but it's destiny unfolding. Whatever happens is viewed as exactly what was destined to happen. So happening according to God's will. not my will or your will. And when I first went to see Ramesh, so this is Ramesh over here, I went to visit him in...
I love him, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually listened to him, his very few videos online for hours and hours and hours, way before I knew anything about you, but I loved him, yeah.
So in 2005, I went to visit him, and it was intended to be just a one satsang visit. So I went to India for 2 days, or maybe even less than 2 days. It was maybe 36 hours, I think, on route to Europe from Australia, and planned that 36-hour stopover so that I could have one satsang. And really, I wasn't going for Ramesh's teaching. I was going because the teachings of Nisargadatta Maharaj had such an impact on how I knew myself, essentially. So a revelation and a grounding into this formless aspect, because that really is a lot of what the teachings of Nisargadatta through the book, I Am That, focus on, or at least that's how I was interpreting it, and I had read it many times, and I sort of felt like that was my teaching. And so when I found out that Ramesh was a translator for Nisargadatta and that he was giving satsang, I really just went essentially to pay my respects to Nisargadatta, not really Ramesh, not knowing what Ramesh's teaching was. And then a storm happened when I was there, in that I landed. I went to the satsang, so I landed at midnight, 9 o'clock in the morning I was at satsang, and then that day these massive storms happened, and the airport was closed down for about 8 days because of these storms. And so I ended up spending 10 days with Ramesh, which was my destiny and exactly what was needed. And it was very significant, very profound shaking up of my ideas, because at that point, my idea about enlightenment was essentially that it is about coming to know yourself as awareness. And the teachings I had been exposed to had really very little to do with the level of daily living. It was really pointing at much more transcendent, ironically, what today's satsang was talking about, finding this deeper aspect of ourself. However, in today's satsang, it's really about showing there's two aspects to the human being, and we have to know the combination of the two as what we are, and find that knowing ourselves is what delivers peace of mind in daily living. But at the time prior to going to meet Ramesh, my contemplating really wasn't focusing on anything practical. It wasn't so much focusing or thinking that seeking had much to do with the person, but rather seeking was about realizing the infinite, the absolute, the formless, of which plenty of insights had happened and experiences had happened, and therefore, because these insights were happening, the idea that it was about that became sort of more and more entrenched, because the more that I was seeking and inquiring and contemplating with that aim in mind, the more realizations and the more of that aspect of the human revealed itself. And so, in a sense, the seeking became really non-practical, which I didn't realize. I thought it was very practical, because what was happening were experiential realizations as opposed to conceptual ones. And so when Ramesh was talking about practical, at first I thought, yeah, of course, practical means experiential, which it doesn't.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, practical means living as a human being, going to work and keeping, your objectives in your thinking relative to the practical realm, as opposed to, the infinite and the absolute. And so the first visit shook quite a lot of stuff up, but it didn't really take my mind off the fact that seeking was about realizing consciousness. And so a month or two, I think, 2 months after, when I was back in Australia, I had a oneness experience that was the most profound oneness experience I had had, but it didn't really reveal anything that hadn't been registered before. So when I went to see Ramesh, I would say that there wasn't a lot of suffering. There was a deep understanding of this aspect that had been talked about in most of the esoteric teachings. And then this oneness experience was a very pristine, you could say, rather than subtle, very complete, pristine demonstration of the non-duality of life and the nature of what I am as awareness and everything arising within that awareness, not separate from the awareness, witnessed by the awareness, the sense that the body was simply an object, and if someone were to come and chop my arms off, they wouldn't even come close to touching what I was. That's what that profound oneness experience demonstrated, and what feedback it delivered directly. Now, I wouldn't say that that's particularly accurate, to be honest. At the time, because of the nature of the experience, it felt like it was revealing truth, and that anything to do with personal living and experiencing life as a duality was essentially considered to be illusion and a non-recognition of the non-duality of life. So I got on a plane several days later, I think, back to see Ramesh, and he saw me. Oh, Roger, you're back. What brings you here? And so I went in and described this this whole experience that had happened, and using very good non-dual terms, not referring to anything as my doing, but not even referring to myself as the person. It was very fresh in my mind, and I thought I described it in a way that he would know exactly what I was talking about. And I finished, and he said, "Roger, don't worry about it. It was just an experience." And I thought, well, he hasn't obviously understood what I'm saying. I mustn't have communicated it very well. So I sort of tried to fill in some gaps. And once again, he said, "Roger, that was just an experience. Don't worry about it." And so I went a third time, just, last-ditch effort. And same thing, "Roger, that was just an experience. Don't worry about it." And for me, that moment, that experience, didn't at all feel like an experience, because to me, at that time, the word experience denoted duality and illusion, and experience was referred to in all of the teachings I was as essentially what you have before realization, and then when realization, it's the end of experience, it's the end of subject-object relationship, and it's direct knowing, where there is no knower. And so that experience included all of that in it. And so my assumption was, well, that has to be reality, because for years before that, that's how it was all being described. And so when Ramesh said that was just an experience, don't worry about it, believe me, I went in on the second attempt and said, but it was an experience because there was no subject aware of separate objects outside of itself. There was just subjectivity. There was just witnessing, no witnesser. And, kept describing. And he said, "Roger, that was just an experience. Don't worry about it." And so nothing inside of me felt like he knew what he was talking about. It just didn't seem like he was appreciating, in a sense, what had happened. So anyway, I came back to Australia, and this had happened on a morning walk. So I was convinced, and I was always convinced that this enlightenment business was, my destiny. And so now that had happened, I was sure that it was just, around the corner. The system was completely primed, which is why that happened. And now it's just a matter of, so just a matter of some more graceful weeks or whatever, and then it will set in for good in the same way as it had in that morning. And after about 3 weeks, I found myself walking in exactly the same route, and each time I'd get to the place, I sort of brace myself for maybe today is the day. And at some point, I realized that this craving, this expectation, this waiting for something had set in. And fortunately, I had listened to Ramesh's teaching in this period over and over and over on recordings. And even though it hadn't really hit me what the teaching was, I knew it intellectually. I just hadn't put the concepts on the right level or linked them together. And what was also fortunate is that even though I said that seeking wasn't really about the practical stuff for me, it was more about this transcendental stuff. In between that, I always came back to my suffering and said it's about my wrong attitude. So intuitively, all the way through the seeking, before meeting Ramesh, there was sort of this movement between transcendence and contemplation that was looking at the practical. And yet consciously, I still thought it was just about transcendence somehow. When the suffering kicked in for a craving for something to happen, that's when it dawned on me that could he be right? When he said, Roger, that was just an experience, don't worry about it. And up to that moment, I can assure you there wasn't the slightest part of my system that thought he was right.
That had any doubt, yeah.
Yeah. And in that moment, I thought, what if he's right? Because if he's right, I'm waiting for and have an expectation of an enlightenment that is actually only an experience, if he's right. And so then I thought, wow, if that's the case, I have to drop any notion that liberation is this oneness experience and realize that it's just the absence of suffering, which I had up to this point, by and large, for several years. There wasn't much suffering. So when this craving came in, I very quickly registered it as, no, this is the problem. This craving is the problem. And it was when I registered that this is the problem, waiting for that to come in, that's when something snuck in through a gap, which was this thought, what if he's right? And in the instant of thinking that, my attention went from liberation being about some transcendental realization or experience to being about exactly what he repeated over and over again in the teaching, which is liberation is simply unbroken peace of mind and daily living for the human being. And in that moment I go, I have that. All that's disturbing that is this craving for what he's described as just an experience, don't worry about it. And so that allowed me to then relate to that as just an experience. And from that point on, there was no craving for any mystical experiences, no craving for any peak experiences. And what then kicked in was a refocusing on the remnants of suffering that still remained, that were really quite mild, which is why I hadn't really noticed them. But I started to see where the subtle sense of personal doership existed, where the subtle expectation still existed about, for example, valuing my lifestyle, which was fortunate at that time in that I had plenty of time to myself, didn't have to work so hard, and occasionally I'd have this thought saying, what if my situation changes? That would be terrible. And so then I didn't necessarily say that would be terrible. I said, what if my situation changed and I'd have to go and work in a job that I don't really feel like doing? And I doubted, or I didn't realize that there was this involvement in an outcome, thinking that my happiness was because of my fortunate circumstance. So there were these small attachments that still remained. And so once the focus became simply on peace of mind, which was the end of, or the absence of suffering, the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, then the seeking process kicked off again, in a sense, with this new focus. And so hence, that's why I suggested that what may feel like a plateau to you could be the beginning of a next phase. And it could also indicate that, because you said it's plateauing, and in fact, the spiritual seeking should plateau. In fact, it should completely come to an end. And it comes to an end and plateaus when there's something really, really simple there, which is simply the non-arising of the old form of relating to pleasure and pain, and the seeing of oneself as an autonomous entity where you feel pride for the good actions and shame for the less good actions and blame towards the other. So the fact that you see it as, oh, it's plateauing and that might not be so good, could be an indication that there is a subtle waiting for things to get much more fancy in a way, i.e. thinking that, you know, the culmination of the spiritual seeking is some transcendental breaking of some structure that delivers a fairly intense peak experience. And the story I'm putting forward, hopefully, is, Roger, don't worry about it. That was just an experience. Enlightenment, liberation, in practical terms, is something very simple. It's the remaining of the human being no longer with the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome, and therefore a human being that finds themselves being lived in life, and with the different forms of resistance to life not being there.
Roger, that's the most helpful teaching I've heard in quite some months. Just not because of the teaching of the others, but I think just because of where I am, as you were saying. I really appreciate you sharing that story, because it's thank you so much. It's been very, very helpful. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I think that's probably one of the most significant shifts in the seeking process I know, and some of the most heartfelt messages I get are from people who have been seeking for 15 years in a non-dual, top-down approach, and that has delivered very significant shifts that have basically meant that thinking is seen in a healthy perspective, that the relative world is seen to be exactly that, witnessed from a place that maybe didn't witness life before. However, the missing piece was this, in a way, bringing it back down to being human. And so when people write and say, you know, wow, listening to that story of yours, and how you're describing it in terms of what liberation or enlightenment is in practical terms, has been the missing link. And I think it's exactly how it can work, is that someone can find themselves going round and round the sort of top-down approach where various realizations have happened, which is something, as I say, that we should be most grateful for. However, this missing piece needs to be delivered so that the integration can happen. So hopefully that's what's happening.
And this is what I've been trying to figure out for the past couple of months, and I guess it brought me here. And thank you. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for dropping in. Hi, Jim. It's Roger here. How are you?
Hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Hello. I have one question. Is it that this one thing that we must do to calm our minds once and for all, so to speak? This practice to hold our attention to the sense of I am, or is this because I observe for time to time our thoughts, my thoughts, comes and goes, and sometimes they grab me. So if I hold on to this practice, or not like hold, just, you know what I would try to say. This practice, eventually, it is all we must do. This is.
Well, I think that when that is what is important, when that is the part of the puzzle that is being worked on and needs to fit into place, then yes, that what you're describing is all that we need to do, which isn't even our doing. It's a recalibrating of our system so that happens more and more regularly. But in another phase, there are other focuses that are different to just remaining aware and coming back to I am. But in the phase where that is what's important, yes, as you say, the continually remembering whenever it happens that I am, and seeing that the thoughts have taken over, that dropping back to your home or returning to I am, abiding in I am, is, let's say, all that needs to happen. And in time, it weakens the intensity of the thinking. It weakens the identification with the thinking, and then the balance of power changes from the thinking mind that is always identified with the thought and with outcomes and with what happened in the past and the future, and the balance changes where we can rest in our our presence much more easily, much more regularly, with much more consistency.
I observe throughout daily, I am here. I can sense that I am here.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes when I observe thoughts comes that it is not something very, this is not it. It can't be so easy. And I trapped in these thoughts, and I say maybe I need to study again, to see to see some videos again and again, so I can be sure that I reached it. I think,
yeah. Sorry, go.
Yes, but I think inside my heart, and I say it from my heart, that yes, it is very easy, but maybe this feeling that I must do something more, maybe this feeling is also right, because I still think, I still thinking psychologically. Yes, but from the other side, I don't want to. I want to be able to think. So this is from this side, and this side, that I'm tired of this.
Right. Yes. I have some feedback. When the suffering stops completely, then there's no doubt, because the doubt is actually still a form of suffering. We doubt when there is a layer of suffering in the system. So it could be even just like a very mild layer of boredom. And someone says, is this it? Really? And when the mild layer of boredom is there, it isn't really it, because the boredom is there. So that means that we're not really resting in being. And so the realization isn't about, a one time or 10 time realization, or even when you find you can rest there 10 times in a day. It isn't so much about the realization of being, and saying, oh, now I know, I regularly know my being. What I would say is more accurate of like what liberation or what enlightenment is not about a realization of self or a realization of being or a resting in being, but the end of uncomfortableness with oneself, or its opposite, continuous peace of mind. Now, this movement into being is a very important movement as part of the dissolving of the suffering, very important movement as part of the peace of mind setting in. But if we are focused on the being as the goal, that can be a problem, because in my experience, even resting in being needs to fall away. And the resting, so if we think that it's about being, then our expectation is about being. And so we're never really going to be satisfied, because we say, is this it? And what I'm suggesting here is being isn't it. Being is an aspect of the self that we can drop into outside of thinking. So when the thinking mind happens, we need somewhere that we can go, we can say, oh, I am, like a remembrance, I am, and find ourselves resting outside of the thinking mind. And so when we find ourselves dropping into isness or beingness time and time again, it is linked with the dropping away of suffering, right? Because we drop into being, we remember I am, when we see suffering is present, when we see the thinking mind is there. And then we remember I am, and we drop into being, and we can rest there for however long it's destined for us to rest there. And then if the suffering starts again the next day or later on that day, we essentially recognize, oh, I'm in suffering again, and we go, I am, and we drop into being. When the suffering stops arising, when it's not there anymore, when the roots of the suffering has been dissolved, then the importance of resting in being falls away. It's not such an important place anymore, because we find ourselves just waking up in the morning, getting dressed, going out in the car. We realize, oh, I've got a flat tire, and we have to deal with the flat tire, but it doesn't turn into suffering. And so because it doesn't turn into suffering, we don't need to remind ourselves, oh, I am. When it turned into suffering, because we had a flat tire, then we needed to remember, oh, I am, and rest in being. But once the suffering has stopped, then you can go for 2 days, 3 days, and realize, oh, I haven't had any specific awareness of my own being, but that's okay because I haven't had any suffering come up in relation to, the things that didn't go right. And that's when it might dawn on us that this peace of mind business is even simpler than being. It is even the absence, or not the absence of being, because when being is there, it doesn't mean that you don't have peace of mind. Being is a version of peace of mind that is more complex in a good way, right? It's a connection to self. Pardon? You can hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So being it's not that isn't peace of mind, but it's a more complex, in a good way. It's a more complex version of peace of mind. There is a very simple version of peace of mind, which is doesn't even have the beingness present. And I would say that if we have an expectation that beingness is how we know ourselves on a continuous, unbroken basis, that is an expectation of peace of mind that is more than the peace of mind that is available. So the lowest common denominator of peace of mind is really simple, just the absence of suffering. And then many times in the week or in the day, we can drop back into being and have a more complex version of peace of mind. And appreciate that, be grateful for it. We say, this aspect of myself, and feel it. But let's be careful if that resting in being becomes an expectation and becomes an idea of something more that I need. Maybe.
So, what am I to do? Continue to observe what?
So what I just put forward is my description, right? Which is new conditioning as part of the flow of life. So the description is something that says, look, maybe we have an expectation that liberation or peace of mind is the same as continuous beingness. And so that description is saying, no, well, peace of mind might be much more simple than beingness, and beingness is a place that needs to have opened up so we can drop out of suffering into being. Because if we don't have that place of being and there's suffering, when the thinking mind is still active, it won't stop unless we have somewhere outside of the mind to go. So that's why the being is so important, that place of being. So this is essentially new conditioning that might become part of your up-to-date conditioning that will get in the way of an expectation of resting in being continuously. Because that's not needed. So I would say let life flow. You don't need to do anything. You are always going to function based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So this discourse that we're having is new conditioning. It's recorded, so if it's interesting to you to hear it again, you can go and hear it again. And it will or it won't change you, and therefore the seeking tomorrow might be different from the seeking yesterday.
So I don't have to observe or do anything.
No, the observing is always a happening if it happens. The suffering is a happening if it happens. Everything is a happening. So the idea you have to do something, you can drop that. You drop the idea you have to do anything, and I guarantee you that things will happen. They are always happening that way. So the idea of what do I do is in itself part of the doership belief.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, I think we have time for one more. Hello, Andrew.
Hello. I'm going to get my video on here.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. Cool. I have a question about like a subtlety, I think, of the discourse today. Where you started with talking about quantum mechanics and quantum physics and Newtonian physics.
Mm-hmm.
When you first started talking about that, I thought, and you were describing like how in quantum physics, if we look deeper and deeper and deeper, that nothing's there. My first thought about that popped up was, oh, that's like a direct. One can see from that is a direct experience that the world is formless.
Mm-hmm.
But then I said, well, hold on a second. If, for example, if I was a physicist and I was looking at a very powerful microscope and forms started to disappear into just like movements of energy or nothing at all, then that's still in form. So is the appearance of in form of the disappearance of form sort of like an analogy in the way that, for example, if so people dream at night, and a dream is somewhat of like an echo of the reality of what is happening here. A dream is sort of like we are. When you have a dream, you take your character in your mind, and we are all kind of characters in God's mind, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Is the relationship between quantum physics and Newtonian physics sort of also like kind of like an analogy that describes reality in that way?
Well, I would say that as I was putting it forward here, is that there are two layers on the same dimension, and not so much like a dream being a layer within, let's say, the waking state dream, which is a sort of like a dream within a dream. So they're on different layers or different dimensions to each other. So as I was describing it, the quantum and the mechanical are essentially on the same dimension, which make up the one life. And yet we still also have to, it's not that linear, because the example, as I used it, said that the quantum is below the surface and the mechanical is on the surface. But what I'm suggesting now is that the below the surface and above the surface are actually the same dimension, not two different dimensions. And then at the same time we can look at it, because remember, what I'm putting forward are concepts, they're not the truth. The truth is, these are essentially concepts that describe life with a particular purpose, you could say, in mind. So the purpose is a pointing purpose. So it's not that what I'm saying is the absolute truth, because there will be other conceptual frameworks or pointers in relation to this particular topic that have a different objective in mind to demonstrate something different than that I'm trying to demonstrate. And so in another teaching, or not so much teaching, but from another perspective, someone might want to demonstrate that the form emerges out of the formless. And if that's the objective in the point being made, or in the objective of the analogy, then you could see the form as being on a different dimension to the formless. And in that case, the form is like the dream is to the daily life person. It's a creation on another dimension outside of daily life. So I wasn't describing it like that, but at the same time, what I would describe like that is both the dimension of mechanical and quantum, which I had said are on the same dimension. Both of, or that dimension can come out of something which is absolute nothing. So the quantum level I spoke about is not absolute nothing, it's more like nothing on the realm of manifestation. And then the layer of the mechanical is something on the level of the manifestation. And the layer of nothing and the layer of something is what are both contained in the manifestation, or are the manifestation. And then I would introduce the concept that the manifestation springs out of the unmanifest. The unmanifest becomes the manifest. And the manifest has those two layers that we were talking about.
Perfect, thank you. That answers the question. And then I also have another quick confirmation. So one does not need to be constantly aware that everything is themselves for that unbroken peace of mind to be there. That's correct?
That is correct. I mean, the process of reminding yourself to become aware is very much the same principle as I was referring to in the previous question. It's more a movement that can happen to essentially remind us of the part of ourself that is not physical, and it can snap us out of the psychological narrative that is attached and identified with the physical, and attached and identified with doership and outcomes. So when you find yourself with the thinking mind active, becoming aware of the awareness in which everything arises is a similar movement to dropping into being or I am. They're two aspects of consciousness. The being or I am tends to be much more embodied in the body, and becoming aware of yourself as formless awareness tends to be sort of more transcendent. But both movement into either aspect of consciousness, either the embodied isness or the transcendent awareness, is a way of dropping out of the thinking mind. But once the thinking mind is sort of atrophied and is no longer throwing up that self-image and that uncomfortableness, then the need to continually be aware of awareness falls away, because the real litmus test is to be able to live fully as the human being, to really realize, even if life is a dream or seen to be an appearance in consciousness, these realizations don't suddenly propel me out of the dream. And so we have to realize, actually, I just have to get on with being human and not denying, life and whatever. And then it's where, that's really the chop wood and carry water. You get back to doing daily living.
Yeah, thank you. Very clear.
Okay, pleasure. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, well, I'd like to wish everyone a very happy Easter, one that is going to be different for most people to the ones of the past, and hopefully different to the ones of the future. So thank you for joining me up to this point. Satsang won't be happening tomorrow, but it will recommence on Monday.